All right, it looks like it is 4 o'clock already. So we'll get started with our final session of the day. It has been I'm overwhelmed with how much I've learned, and I can't wait to download the chat and look for the resources next week also. Um, but I'd like to introduce you to our two final presenters, Juana Reyes and Jennifer Hernandez. So Dr. Reyes is on the faculty at Lewis University. She's in the early childhood education program, and she specializes in the Reggio Emilia approach to early childhood. I have spoken with her about it a couple of times, and every time she just brings a new facet of knowledge to me that I had no idea of. It just sounds fascinating. And then Dr. Jennifer Hernandez, if you've been with us, if you stayed with us today, you would have heard her as one of the panelists right after our keynote speaker. And she is a veteran special education teacher. She currently teaches at the Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, in the secondary program. So we're going to get to hear early childhood perspectives and secondary perspectives today. What we've asked the panelists to do is to take about 15 minutes each and speak about what they're doing in this area of classroom environment, social justice, and equity. And then we have a couple of questions for the panelists. We'll also be taking questions from the audience. So if anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat for our panelists. So Dr. Reyes, would you start us off, please, talking about your practice?
Yes, I sure will. Can I share my screen? Great, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today to discuss this really important topic. I'm happy to be here with my co-presenter as well, Dr. Jennifer Hernandez. My presentation will focus on the philosophical and physical notion of learning environments. I'll share images from early learning settings that use aspects of the Reggio Emilia approach in the US. So most of these are US settings. There might be a couple of images from Reggio Emilia as well sprinkled in. Before we consider classroom environments, we should consider our image of the child, parent, and the teacher. Robert Holmes and Moss highlight some of the images of early education that have emerged from neoliberal ideologies. The image of the child as an investment, the image of the parent as a consumer, the image of the early childhood center as a factory business, or just a prep for real school. One approach that offers a counter narrative to the business model of the field is the Reggio Emilia philosophy, developed in northern Italy in a small town of the same name. This philosophy offers a different image of the child, parent, teacher, and school. Resistance is to be found in many shapes and sizes. It finds expressions in many alternative stories that give voice to the multitude of perspectives and debates in early childhood education. These stories may be unheard by power and consigned to the margins for the time being at least, but they are out there to be heard by those who choose to listen. My philosophy of classroom environment first and foremost centers around the identity and image of the child as a capable protagonist or active collaborator in their learning. Children come to us full of experience and ready to learn. A lot like the previous presenter, Dr. Brown, mentioned, that we have to acknowledge experience with which children join us and come to our learning, the learning setting. So children have to be taken seriously and believed. Children have rights and not needs. There's more of a focus on children's potentials rather than deficits in this approach to early education. And on the left actually is a photograph. This is at the entrance of each of the schools in Reggio Emilia, Italy, that this is a space of rights. So they recognize children as having rights within their, and being citizens of their community. Too often we adopt what Paulo Freire termed the banking model of education. We see children as empty vessels waiting to be filled up by our wisdom and knowledge. We forget to recognize that as educators, we are also learners. Knowledge and understanding is not a finite commodity. Rather, understandings are built through relationship. The environment must provoke the thought, wonder, and curiosity of children and teachers as well. We should finally bury the notion that knowledge is a finite commodity. This drawing was actually made by a teacher that I work with in Phoenix. We invited her to reflect on how she believes society views early education. Today, I'm going to offer you an invitation to disrupt the narrative of education that focuses on the child as a subject of learning, a passive participant, an empty vessel. Consider a narrative in which we acknowledge and celebrate the identity of the child, the parent, and the teacher. Education is a mixture of complex interactions, many of which take place only when the setting is involved. So the setting is key and integral to this approach. Some considerations. Does the environment reflect upon and support the image of the child, of who the child is, or what the child is capable of? Or does it merely emphasize what the child is not, does not have, or cannot be? So I'm going to actually share slides that look at elements of the environment in the early learning setting. So first we'll look at the idea of color and light. So these are really different elements. A lot of times we think about the classroom as being the four walls, the seating, the seating arrangement, where children sit, where the teacher is positioned in the classroom, where the children need to focus their eyes, right? But this is looking at an alternative view of specific elements of the environment. So starting first with color and light, changing the color. This is research out of the University of Alberta, Canada. Changing the color and lighting in a room decreases children's aggression and lowers blood pressure, whether they are sighted or blind. Natural light and artificial full spectrum lighting has been found to minimize mental fatigue as well as reduce hyperactivity in children. So on the left, we have an image of a classroom that's painted very dark, a very dark and saturated color. And on the right is a photo of a classroom that values light and subtle color and also transparency of the windows. And the windows actually bring the outdoor into the classroom and allow children to really climb up and see outside as well. This is a classroom in a second story of a program. This is just an image of a child noticing shadows. So we should consider not only what's in our classroom, but also the sunlight coming in and how that might be used to reflect the identity of the children in the classroom. Transparency and reflection. Mirrors offer a feeling of openness, and they are invaluable to making spaces appear larger. They have a reflective quality that brings light into dark spaces and increases lighting intensity. So this is actually a slide of it's actually mirror tiles placed above a changing table, so the infants can see themselves as they're changed. And here's an example of mirrors placed in spaces that are often overlooked. But this provides an opportunity for the child to see themselves from a different point of view. And it also involves the hallway area, which is, as I said, often overlooked. So it's important to think about. Transparency in the form of a window between classrooms offers an opportunity to build relationships with neighbors in the next classroom. Levels, boundaries, and room arrangement. Children are both fascinated and intimidated by height. Feeling small relative to the world around them, opportunities to be high up above it all give them a sense of power and privacy. They also enjoy being down under tables, stairs, lofts, and being able to hide. Platforms, risers, and lofts are important ways to create spatial variety and offer children possibilities to develop competence in negotiating up and down variations. So this is actually a tunnel between two toddler classrooms. So they can actually vacillate between the classrooms, either from climbing under the tunnel or going up above in the loft. This is another classroom. This section actually provides a boundary. So a boundary is provided by the canopy structure that's over a small space within a classroom. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about furniture and interesting objects. Furnishings or equipments. Equipment can provide a sense of wonder, social interaction, problem solving, a connection to culture, a sense of identity, a sense of comfort, creativity, and a visual aesthetic. This is also in a toddler classroom. And this is a preschool classroom. So now considering patterns and textures. Softenings can be very important to the comfort of young children. If children do not feel comfortable in a space, they will not concentrate as well as they might. So this is a nice example. Actually, this is from Reggio Emilia, Italy. This is an infant toddler space. And you'll see on the bottom left-hand side, there's stairs to climb up because toddlers are really interested once they get that skill of walking and climbing, or when they're developing it, they like to be able to go up, and they also like to be able to slide down. And then there's also some soft options within the classroom. And you can notice the pattern that the exterior lattice is throwing onto the wall. And that's important to recognize as well. Here's another space. Again, notice the different textures and patterns and alternative seating as well. The design of meandering pathways can increase the opportunities for positive social interaction. Use circulation to create a gentle transition from different spaces, taking advantage of turns and bends to create unique areas of learning. Beauty in nature. Children establish a companionship with nature. Jane Addams said this. And so this is an example of a school in northern Phoenix that's situated in the middle of the desert. And so teachers invited the children to study the plants in the desert. And they represented them with paper mache. This school is actually set in a farming village or town in California. And so the hatching of chickens is very important to the context of the community. And looking at examples of digital scapes. In these slides, children are engaged in exploring their environment using digital cameras, overhead projectors, digital projectors, webcams, digital microscopes, small objects. Some are actually found in nature. And on the left, you can't see, but on the left-hand side towards the bottom, there's an actual opportunity for the children to code this platform that turns around and moves the dinosaurs that are in the background, moves them around the platform. Again, each of these images is taking into consideration things that are important to children, things that they know about and want to know more about as well. Culture and identity. Research indicates that personalization of space is an important factor in the formation of an individual's identity and sense of self-worth. This is just an example of documentation. Teachers actually captured the first time that these young children used a writing implement, and they took a photograph. Not just, they actually captured the image, but they also took a photograph of the child's hand on the day that they first made marks on paper. So in these schools, connecting to the community is very important. This is actually an image of the Opera House in Reggio Emilia, Italy. The children made a connection to a four-string quartet that came to their school and played. And then this was an exchange back with the Opera House as well. They made a clay representation of the four-string group, actually orchestra, coming to their school. So some goals for the environment would be to develop an understanding that the environment provokes and sustains learning through a balance of comfort and stimulation. To develop an understanding that the environment supports children in making connections between what they already know and the world around them, such as people, places, and the natural world. And to develop an understanding that the environment supports children in academic, physical, social, and emotional and creative learning. Infants and children in all places of the world cannot continue to have rights only on paper. The right to have good parents, good housing, good food, good schools, and good teachers and good government is what they ask for and what is urgently needed. If we adults keep in mind that children are always the holders of new possibilities and perspectives, and not only in the field of learning and knowledge, perhaps we will not carelessly dissipate with guilty nonchalance the good that they, along with we, possess. This is a quote from Loris Malaguzzi, the founder of the Schools of Reggio Emilia, Italy. People's narratives and stories are important in truly understanding their experiences and how these experiences may represent confirmation or counter knowledge of the ways in which society works. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juana. I know Tony put a question in the chat. I think we'll hold it until Jennifer has a chance to talk, and then we'll get to the questions. So Jennifer.
Thank you, Dr. Reyes. It's always refreshing to remind me about the world of early childhood education. I've spent my teaching career with secondary, and it's definitely a different experience. So I'm sharing my screen now too, and would like to just take a minute to kind of talk to you about what I'm teaching in-service teachers and anti-racism professional development training, as well as the teacher candidates, about social justice, climate, instructional strategies in a classroom, and how we can use that to really disrupt the status quo, right? That default white dominance, or the default of the system to be inequitable. So this quote from Bell Hooks is a definition of social justice. Certainly it's not mine, but it comes from the work of Paulo Freire. And in here, she talks about the goal being that equal participation of all groups in a society, right? That was really shaped to meet the needs of the people who live there. That seems pretty, standard of what we would all think equity would look like, and seeing that humanity. But it's also a process, right? And it's a process that involves social actors. And that's where Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed work comes in. It's Friday, 4:15, too much talking today. He really talked about teachers developing a praxis, this critical consciousness, this awareness of the inequity that exists in society, along with an action plan, right, of how to minimize that inequity in the classroom. Of course, none of us think that teachers are going to solve racism. I wish they could. They probably would be able to if we set that goal. But within our classrooms, we can make sure it doesn't exist, right? Because we do get to control that space. And so how do we do that? And the beginning is really about teaching pre-teachers to our teacher candidates that society is unequal. Believe it or not, many of them don't even realize that that is true, right? Especially with the majority of our teacher candidates being white females, they believe their lived experience looks like everyone else's. So I spend a lot of time talking about these 4 points, of course, and what justice would look like. But then when I pair it up like fair and equitable distribution of resources, we can just look at school funding and show that there's no justice there, right? And so as we go in, it's kind of a part of creating that critical consciousness within the teacher candidates and in-service teachers so that they can turn around and actually create those critical consciousnesses in their students. That's the idea, right? But we have to get them to get it first. So we go through every marginalized and subjugated socially constructed identity, from heterosexism to classism to religious oppression, language oppression for our teachers that will teach in schools that are sanctuary schools. And so they have refugees, children who just arrived and don't speak a lick of English. How do you support them? You can, even if you don't speak Vietnamese or Nicaraguan or any of the languages that they speak. It's understanding that diversity isn't really a noun, right? It's more of a verb, and having a concrete knowledge of different groups and their experiences so that they understand that their lived experience may be privileged in some ways and marginalized in the others, but it's not the same lived experience of a young Black child or a young Black boy or a young Latina girl who just arrived to the country. It's just not going to mirror. And so social justice is about reconstructing societies with principles of equity. We have to do that in the classroom first, right? Before. And what's so awesome is colleagues like Dr. Reyes, who's starting in early childhood, and then our elementary colleagues, and then our secondary, and then our higher ed, all of us working together, we could literally change the way the world works. Because as you know, we are the profession that creates every other profession, right? So if we can embed that as young as 3 and continue that all the way through their secondary and into their higher ed, we really can make that impact we're looking for. Social justice education requires this intersectional disciplinary conceptual framework. So it's not just critical race theory, it's not just abolitionist teachings, but it's all of it. It's therapeutic, it's the social emotional, it's the visual, it's the artistic, all these frameworks coming together with a critical consciousness around the status quo. We're talking about the lived experiences of our students. And so we must have experiential pedagogical practices in our teaching. What is happening in the community and how can we support, right, you living in the present with the education we give you here in this classroom today. Understanding the pervasive nature of social inequity and that it's everywhere, and teaching students how to spot it. First, we teach the teacher candidates how to spot it and the in-service teachers, and they start teaching students. Because once we understand where those pivotal pieces are, we can start to disrupt, right? And then again, giving students the tools needed to develop their own praxis of a critical consciousness and then an action plan from there. The 3 ways in which teachers can create this in their classroom starting tomorrow, right, is by affirming identity, building community, and cultivating leadership within their classroom. The 3 tenets right there, along with the curriculum pieces that are also different than the master narrative and offering, other perspectives, together can create this climate. When we talk about affirming identity for students, we've said it all day today. Where are they in the curriculum, right? And so I'm not going to rehash that. We've talked plenty about that. but the lack of diversity in the teaching profession. I stress this so much in my classes and in my trainings with teachers, that public education is a system of white supremacy. Black children have not had a good experience in their education. Why would they become teachers and be paid what they pay us, which is shameful, right? To be harmed and reharmed and try. It's not a place people want to go if you are feeling oppressed and marginalized. We have to change that. And that's on us, right? To change that our classrooms do not become these oppressive places by bringing in, right, and recruiting and retaining, right, and then creating new teachers within our classrooms. Educators must be knowledgeable about who their students are. We don't have to know about every culture and every identity. It's a lot to hold in one head, but you better know the identities in your room, right? And what their value systems are and their lived experiences, so that you can have empathy and also an ability to access it in a democratized space for them to share their truth. As a teacher, you're going to have to ask and listen, listen, listen. We make so many assumptions about who they are based on their address or their older sibling, right? Or that one time you saw their mother, whatever. We make a lot of assumptions about who our kids are, but it's really important that we become curious actors and we allow the students to teach us who they are. And then any teacher willing to work for an affinity identity in their classrooms, you're going to have an engaged class, right? If they know you see them, you have a different level of engagement than traditionally. In building community, just really focusing on creating that classroom community. I know some teachers like say they're scholars, or they refer to them as, you know, they're the little ducks and she's the mama duck and all of these things when they're in elementary. And as they get older, sometimes they're the purple team or the blue team or the 8th grade team. But however you build that community, you're doing it in a way that is multi-gender, multi-ethnic, multiracial, collaborations every step of the way. Everything is very strategic in the grouping to make sure that marginalized identities are equally represented with the dominant identities. Key for teaching is to minimize the stereotype threats in the learning environment, and the teachers must know their own biases before they do that. They must understand the stereotypes that are attached to each of these socially constructed marginalized identities and the identity contingencies that come with that. And when that happens, we have to directly address it in such ways as highlighting those identities in the positive good. And then, of course, removal of the top-down authority system from the 50s. I'm an old Catholic schoolgirl, so I had nuns with rulers. So talk about authority frameworks, right? But really democratizing that learning space. Why is the teacher's desk in the front of the room with all the desks facing her or him, right? Who should be in the front of the room? The kids, the content, right? Moving the teacher out of being in that place of soul knowledge and soul authority. And then cultivating leadership by teaching active participation in a democracy and the assumption that leadership comes from all parts of the community. So every person has a part in that leadership role. That 21st century, we're a globalized world now, right? Globalized economy, globalized education, understanding that many of these kids may end up in careers where they're sitting at a Starbucks on Zoom, making deals happen across the world. How do we effectively interact with people from those different backgrounds so that we can have that empathy and those communication skills around positionality? And then, of course, facilitating leadership and collaborations. Choosing marginalized identities for specific roles. Don't make the girls always be the scribe of the group because their handwriting's better, right? But let the boys write every once in a while and let the girls speak first, or allow that transgender youth to be in the leadership role that they might be afraid to be seen in. And so having those opportunities to be strategic in the way we make the choices will make the difference. What we know is that teachers who create socially just classrooms do the following things, right? This is what's showing is effective, and it's active and it can be implemented in the curriculum. It can be implemented in the research-based instructional strategies you use, like Marzano's and Lemov and all those great strategies we've been using. But developing that critical consciousness and an awareness of the social factors that actually create oppression. Deconstructing binaries. Do not allow the world of good morning, boys and girls, right? Eliminate good morning, scholars. I'm so glad you're here today. You just included everybody, right? By changing one word. Draw on the counter narratives. Start the story of America with the arrows of the indigenous people and not the arrival of the British, and you have a totally different story, right? So begin a new way of teaching those important cultural events in our history. Analyze power everywhere you see it. So in this policy that the United States government, instilled in 1920, who benefited and who was marginalized? Teach children to see it and diagram it like a composition sentence. Look for the interest convergence. Show them this is why maybe white people didn't say much about redlining, because if all Black and brown folks had to live over here, there were more houses for them to live over here, right? And teach that strategically. Make those global connections for them. They're going to need it. Building those coalitions and bringing together multiple ways of understanding kids from different cultures and different gender expressions and socioeconomic classes to really talk about how would we solve a problem. Follow the leadership of people of color, right? Our people of color have so much in our communities to share and offer, if back to the fact that it's time to listen, right? And not decide what might necessarily be best. And then learn how to be accountable and an ally to your students, to your colleagues, and just to the work of social justice. So I thank you guys again for giving me some time. I know it was a little fast, but I wanted to give you some good tenets of socially just education and something that you could take away with you from this presentation. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we're going to start with Tony's question. And I think although it was originally submitted for Dr. Reyes, I think we can discuss it in both areas here. So he asks, how would you be able to maximize the benefits of you and your students' environments if it is virtual? Dr. Reyes, do you want to start with that?
Sure, I certainly will. So for the youngest of children, we know for children under 2, the 0 to 3 organization actually suggests 0 screen time for children under 2, right? So the children just above that, from 3 to 6 or 3 to 5, we also ask that screen time is limited. But of course, we've been in a pandemic, and that's the way that teachers can connect to children and families, right? A lot of the work that I observed that was the strongest was when teachers worked closely with parents to communicate what children are working on or studying and what have you, so that they could engage parents in the learning process as well. So for example, going on a hunt in their home to find shadows in their home, and then having an opportunity to draw or depict or represent those shadows as an example of one activity. But I think that one thing that this time has given us as early educators is an opportunity to reflect and revision and reimagine what early education should be. So while some programs really kind of threw out what was kind of good practice for early learning, like we know that 4-year-olds shouldn't be in front of a computer screen for 3 hours at a time or whatever it might be, right? We also recognize that there's an interaction if we're using a Zoom or a Google Classroom. That raises the interaction, and it's not a passive activity using the screen. So yeah, I think that we've taken an opportunity to really consider what this moment has meant for us. And you may have recall at the beginning, there were a lot of articles written about like how important the early education teacher really became because in order for parents to go back to work, their children needed caregiving. But as an early educator, we try to emphasize that it's not only caregiving that we're doing, right? That there is learning happening and taking place. So hopefully that wasn't too rambling. And I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, I think I would address that when you're talking about virtual, is actually in secondary, it kind of opens some doors if you think about it. You're still in control of the content and what narrative you choose. As far as assignments and assessments, you can still have those conversations around the power dynamic or the interest convergence that's taking place in this event or this concept. The most flexibility virtual schooling offers is really in the choice of how you assess students. And this is a prime opportunity. And one of the tenets that I hold dear in social justice education is allowing your students to let them creatively show you what they've learned, right? In different ways. Now, I don't mean just create chaos and there's no actual assessments, but teachers can have a menu. I've noticed even my own high school daughter, she has done a video essay. She has done interviews with other people and then edited a video. She's created PowerPoints and she's created flyers and she's done all this digital artwork. So it's been able to give her the opportunity to be creative and expressive around it. And we would want to do that in the classroom too. But I think the idea that we're virtual kind of helps out because now a lot of us have access to software we might not have known about before COVID. And now we can use it, you know, like Zoom. Everybody's pretty good at Zoom now, but before I never used Zoom. I was a FaceTime person. So it's just one of those things. And I think that's how you capture it.
So I'm going to now, since Dr. Reyes focused a lot on the idea of the physical environment and how that framed the idea of being a space of rights. And Dr. Hernandez, you focused more on the social emotional environment, I would say, right? Again, being the socially just space of rights. Let's flip it. So, Dr. Hernandez, do you see any way that we could use the physical space, maybe transform it or use some of those Reggio Emilia practices at the secondary level to make that more of a space of rights where students feel more citizens of their community?
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. So everything that Dr. Ray shared with us and all the different categories of with the nature and the lighting and everything, I was thinking the same thing of how to do that in a way. And I know most importantly, to democratize the classroom space, we have to remove the rows of desks all facing the teacher, right? It can be circular, it could be the Shakespearean in the round, it can be the half, you know, or just tables and chairs, right? That the teacher sits with students at a table and a chair. There does not have to be chairs necessarily. Seating can be very accommodating. I know in my classrooms as a special ed teacher too, I would use in secondary those core balls and students would get a sensory and be able to move because a lot of them need that. They get the fidgety legs. I do too. Look, if you held my hands, I stop talking. I always have to move. So I understand that, right? The ability for students to just get up and walk around, right, during instruction when they feel the need to move or to have the freedom to just take a bio break, right? Like I'm going to just run to the bathroom or I'm just going to go get a drink and it's not a, oh my God, call the office, there's a student in the hall, right? Like it's okay to do that. The other piece, for me, standing desks are great. I loved her bit on the lighting. I personally am offended by fluorescent lights, so I don't use overhead lights. Floor lamps only in a classroom. And a really great trick I teach my teacher candidates is if you go to like a Walmart or a fabric store and you get the scraps, if you use yellows, blues, or greens and you glue a little piece of magnet to it and you can put it over those horrible institutional lights in our public schools and it will actually filter both the noise of and the light. And so it gives this kind of sense of community welcomeness. I also, when possible, try to have meals or snacks together around a table, like a dinner table, even at secondary level, because it helps reinforce this, like, we're all in this together to learn together. This is our space, right? And this is what we're here to do. And the teacher becomes the facilitator and the one who knows those mediative questions to ask to keep the conversation going, but they don't become the authority or the knowledge source. And that's the key to it.
Thank you. Dr. Reyes, what are your thoughts?
So thank you. I think I agree in that we need to think about the messages that environments send. So when I go, I mean, mainly I spend my time in early learning settings, right? But if I go into a classroom that's full of tables and chairs and that's the majority of the space, then I think of the message that we're sending to the children. So already if they walk in, the message is, this is a space where we sit and listen and learn. And, not unlike what Dr. Hernandez was saying was, rearranging the space so that the teacher isn't in the front of the classroom. That isn't usually the case in early ed, although I feel like it's really crept in the last 15, 20 years where the teacher's more the authority and then there's a screen behind the teacher. That wasn't a traditional site that you would see within an early learning setting. What you'd see a lot of times are like what I call a sea of table and chairs. So then the message is we're going to sit. But for early learners, learning should be active. They should be using their entire physicality for learning. So if you only, if you, it's certainly fine to have tables and chairs within a classroom, but if that's the majority of your space, then you're missing out on an opportunity to teach the whole person and not just the ears, right? And the mind. Yeah, good.
Do we have any questions from our attendees? Feel free to unmute yourself if you want to just ask it. If you don't want to type it in the chat.
I think I'll just ask this question. Okay, I had a situation come up this year in my classroom with pre-service teachers on Zoom, and everybody gets on. I have 30 in a class, and fortunately this young man got on early, and it threw me for a loop because he had a Confederate flag with snakes entwined around it behind him. And I'm going, oh my word. And I asked him if he could find a different background, and he did. And fortunately, a lot of people did not get on, but was that the right thing to do? I mean, this really shook me up. And fortunately, only a couple other kids were on. And, what do you, anyway, I'll leave it to your people to talk.
Yeah, I would say you did exactly the right thing. I know it is very strong in white culture that everyone's entitled to their opinion, and that who are you to say what flags he should hang in his house. I get that.
Right.
And I agree with it to a certain extent. At the point when your symbols are denying the humanity of an entire group of people or represent something in history that is genocidal or, enslaving, then that's not an opinion that needs to be respected, right? And I think you did the absolute right thing, and I commend your bravery, because many teachers would act like they didn't see it because they wouldn't have known what to do. But it's always important to look at that and say, if that is dehumanizing, right? If I had, and I don't know your class makeup, but if you had Black students in your class, that is a racialized aggression and act of terror toward them. And I would immediately shut that down and don't be apologetic. I think you did 100% the right thing.
Well, my next thing was to have a meeting with him and tell him how inappropriate it was but I didn't want to do anything in front of other students. You see what I mean? So we had our own private discussion about it. And, but I just could not believe it. You know what I mean? And, he apologized to me, and he didn't have to apologize to the class because fortunately it was taken care of before class started. But, when things like that happen, you're just like, I just couldn't believe it. I guess, yeah, right here in Southern Illinois, here we go. That's why it's important that we have this conference today.
Dr. Reyes, I have a question for you to piggyback off that. So if we start off students in, let's say, the Reggio Emilia program, and they're there for several years, what can we do next so that we don't have students at the college level who don't think twice about putting that in as a background?
Well, so as we know, education is political. So we make a statement by what we do, by what we don't do, by what our space looks like. It's political. We send messages and we make a decision, and whether we like it or not, we're making choices. Whether we make the choices or not making a choice is also a choice, right? So I think it's very important that that we begin with the youngest. However, I don't think the burden is only on early education. Classroom education should be about democracy and allowing and recognizing that children have rights, ideas, thoughts, words, the ability to build their understanding. And if we carry that, like I think actually our last participant, Barbara O'Donnell, had put in the chat, like if we would carry this, if we would pull this mindset of recognizing that children have rights through the course of schooling, then we would all be better for it, right? So allowing children the opportunity to co-construct their knowledge and understanding throughout the schooling is very important, but not just to leave it on the shoulders of early educators, right? But I also have a response to, in my family, we were talking about flags and free speech and what have you, right? Is it covered by the First Amendment? And I said to my dad, well, Dad, isn't it covered by free speech? And he said to me, no, my dad is 90 years old, Korean War veteran. He said, when I was in Korea, somebody in it was a different, he was in the Air Force, so it was a different arm of the military, but they had their settlement, I don't use military terms, so it's probably not called the settlement, but the settlement was right next door to where my dad's troop was. And there was a Confederate flag flying underneath the American flag. And my dad's commander went to him and another person and said, I'm not going to use the exact words, but he said, go take that down right now. That is seditionists. We stand under one flag in our country, and that's a seditionist flag, and it cannot fly together with the American flag. This is in the 1950s. And here we are still having this conversation, the 3/4 of a century later. So yes, like, am I doing my math correctly? Yes, exactly. It's really stunning to me that it's still up for debate. And I also come from I actually come from St. Louis, Missouri. So I'm familiar with the community in Southern Illinois as well.
Yeah, we need to start letting some things be settled, right? They are settled. These are not open debates. So, well, it's 4:50. I want to thank you two. Do we have any additional questions from attendees? If not, then I'm going to do our participants have any final words they would like to share?
Just thank you. It's been a pleasure to work
Yeah,
and to
Just
present.
thanks so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
The session evaluation form is in the chat. And I want to thank you both. And we have one more book to give away. So let's